Thanks very much. It's lovely to have a chance to speak to you about Eugene Cernan, who was the last man on the moon. He came to Carnarvon and opened the new annex of the Space Museum. And then in the evening, Saturday the 28th, he actually was a guest and commentator while the film was showed, The Last Man on the Moon. It's a National Geographic film. Once I got to Carnarvon, I found out that it actually had been shown at the Perth Concert Hall earlier that week. So some of you may actually have seen it. Look, I really couldn't recommend it highly enough. It's really a beautiful film about a person's life and about the aging process, which we're all subject to. He's a guy who, as he said, he walks with a stick now. I went to the moon over 40 years ago. I'm 82 now, and as I'm standing here, he stood in front of a group of 300 or 400 people and brought the kids in. Little kids were there in little spacesuits and all this sort of stuff, and made us feel as if we had gone there with him. Really beautiful sort of experience for me. So now I'll just pass along some of these slides and say a few things as we go. Carnarvon, one of the things about the moonshots was in 1971-72, the parents, the tracking crews who had kids with them obviously, managed to convince the education department to convert the school to a senior high school. I understand that's still the case there. Carnarvon was chosen rather than Mouchet because of the greater breadth of transmission and reception of signals for the spacecraft going over the top. It was also the place for what's called translunar injection, where the spacecraft was sent on its way to the moon. As Eugene Cernan says, coasting, we coasted to the moon. 3 days at 3,500 knots approximately. The space station is where the old OTC terminal was. The NASA site, which is a bit further down that same road near the lake underneath there, was demolished. This is some of the tracking equipment. I took a close-up photo just to be sure, and yes, it's from the Goddard Space Flight Centre. Probably flown into Perth in a Starlifter, C-141, and then trucked up to Carnarvon. It's interesting because the Lockheed Constellation that was used to simulate the spacecraft to check out all the equipment couldn't land at Carnarvon, which actually surprised me even in winter, and they used a DC-6 there for quite a lot of the work. This is called a sugar scope antenna, and it played a part. Perth people got a really good view of Apollo 11, of the first footsteps on the moon, Neil Armstrong. The book's here. This antenna helped to promulgate those signals, and it's there at the museum now. This is some of the contemporary equipment, which was actually donated to the University of Western Australia. Apparently quite a lot of equipment came down, computing equipment, signalling and so on, to UWA, but one of my other colleagues, Terry Woodings, is trying to locate some of it at the moment, so you might be able to help him with that. Apparently everything that's in the museum now would fit onto one of those little sticks that we use. It's also a very good source of archival material, original newspapers, from the shots, daily news and so on and so forth. Quite having an interest in archives as well as aviation and aerospace. It's really interesting from that point of view. Eugene Cernan is in the middle there. That's him. Gene's rocked up with some of his helpers in that big black vehicle. And these people are retired trackers from the space station. it was back to Carnarvon weekend at the same time, and so he was doubly pleased to see so many people who, as I said at the introduction, you were with me on the moon, he said to them. They were all sitting along in the front rows of the auditorium, which you'll see in the next photo. It's the best I could do in the hubbub of that occasion to take this shot, and I apologise for the poor quality. That auditorium holds 60 people, 60 seats, and there were 300 or 400 kids sitting along the front, like even little kindergarten kids, Aboriginal kids, kids from everywhere. And he walked in through those side doors where the exit sign is, and as he walked in he was talking to someone behind, and then he turned around and tears came into his eyes. He said, "What is this?" And of course he got a standing ovation from the whole crowd. And all of those men and women, husbands and wives, most of them worked at the space station or at the NASA station down the road, Australians, Americans, you name it. In fact, in the Australian census of 1971, Carnarvon had more, tertiary educated people than Canberra at the time.
Still the case.
And there was a young woman there. She just finished her Bachelor of Education degree in Perth, and she was really quite overcome by the whole thing. She stood up to ask him a question. He said, "You know, you want to ask, just ask." And she said, "My hero is Pancho Barnes." Pancho Barnes ran a bar and a sort of cafe near one of the precursors of Edwards Air Force Base. Anyone knows about Chuck Yeager will know about Pancho. And she's my hero. And he said to her, "Come up here, darling." So the young woman walked up and he gave her a big hug. And this little kid was sitting in front at the same time with a little sort of spacesuit thing on that they had from the museum. "Hey, you come up as well." And she said, "I want to be a helicopter pilot." And Gene Cernan said to her, "Hey, not so fast. I put 2 of them in the water." That's a photo with the director's assistant outside. Before he came in, no photos, no autographs, no talking to Mr. Cernan. And when he went outside, kids are there with their caps and basketballs and so on. He started autographing and shaking hands and so on. It was really fantastic. I actually shook hands with him, which I was pretty happy about. He and the guy who was a geologist, his name just escapes me at the moment, they were the last people on the moon. There's a few slides here. That left-hand mudguard on the buggy had to be repaired using geological maps because it broke off, it was damaged slightly and dust was going everywhere. They left lots of tracks behind and the equipment, of course, but Cernan actually put his daughter's initials in the moon dust. His daughter was, I don't know, about 6 or 7 at the time. Quite a nice touch. But the film, my impressions. And please, I guess a lot of you have got Foxtel and so on. You may well be able to access this film or get a copy of it very easily. But a few things really stick out for me. As I said before, here's a guy looking at his life, as he does in the book, Last Man on the Moon. United States Navy pilot, retired with the rank of captain. Skyhawk pilot, and there's a shot in the film of him standing next to a Skyhawk at one of the boneyards, so-called, in the US, with its slats extended and so on and so forth. Quite a nice shot. But he's got trouble getting on and off a horse now. He goes riding with one of his mates from the squadron that they joined on USS Constellation, which I understand is a Essex class carrier from the war right through to the 60s. There's a shot in the film, a still, of he and the geologist. They took a shot of each other. They'd been on the moon for an 8-hour shift. They come into the module, took all their spacesuits off, and they're sitting there in their thermal underwear, their long johns in other words, covered in moon dust. This grey stuff. It's quite amazing. That's a shot that was taken. This guy's name is Fred Baldwin. He was a squadron colleague of Eugene Cernan in the late 60s. He went on to fly off Constellation in the South China Sea. He was shot down twice in a week, actually, and lived to tell the tale. He lives in Colorado now, and this shot was taken after the Space Museum was open. Gene Cernan went off to have a sleep because he's quite frail, and this guy was taken to the Pier Hotel at Carnarvon for a beer, and he wanted an Australian beer, so they bought him a Swan Lager. Well, I don't think Swan Lager is a particularly good beer, actually, and I offered to buy him something else later, but no, he sat on that for the whole afternoon. He and Gene Cernan and 2 other pilots formed, not the Blue Angels, they weren't allowed to call their carrier, they had a carrier-based formation flying team. How about that? And there are shots of that in the film as well. They were called the Albino Angels. When they were on the moon, they put the lunar module into a cavity which was further down than the Grand Canyon, which is about a mile deep, as I understand. And they found some orange-coloured rocks and pebbles, and that caused a real stir among the geology team at home, and they wanted to do all sorts of different tests on them. As it turned out, it was from some sort of ancient volcanic surge up into the, not atmosphere of the moon, but up above the surface. And for some reason, they had never cooled in the right way or taken on the grey colour of the surface. At the Mile Long Museum, there's a room, and this is in it. Now, how that's managed not to be grabbed by the War Memorial, I've got no idea. I think there were 2 or 3 of those lifeboats, and that's one of them in the museum there. I just could not believe it. That's it from me.
Well done.